Hey everyone, Ryan Mense here. Today I'm going to be talking about the Sony FX6 for filming wildlife. I spent a couple of weeks out filming with Sony's fully featured compact cinema camera and wanted to share my thoughts on the experience. First up, let's cover the basics. The FX6 uses a full-frame 10.2 megapixel Exmor-R sensor which is capable of capturing 15 plus stops of dynamic range and has dual base ISOs of 800 on the low end and 12,800 on the high end. Internal recording options include 4K up to 120 frames per second or 4K up to 60 frames per second if you need to capture audio as well. You can also do 1080p up to 240 frames per second, which will likely be the only reason to shoot in full HD, so you should be aware that that won't be with audio recording either. Any frame rate option can take advantage of the FX6's 627 phase detect autofocus points, and all of this can be done in 10-bit 422 all intra straight to the memory card. It's also capable of outputting raw 16-bit data streams to compatible recorders. As for some of the precious color science and gamma curve options, there's s-cinetone, which is the quote-unquote cinematic Venice-like combination of gamma curve and color science that can be baked in. There's s-log3 for soaking up maximum dynamic range while shooting at base ISOs, and s-709, which is a quote-unquote cinematic Venice-like LUT applied to the s-log3 recording to either be monitored that way or baked in like s-cinetone is. The camera cost $6,000 and was first released in December 2020. Now let's go over some of the design aspects and what I like and don't like. When I was first getting the camera rigged up, I appreciated that the baseplate I own that's specifically designed to fit the FS5 also fit the FX6. However, there is a difference in terms of the lens mount height between the two cameras, where the FX6 sits much higher. It still worked out for me, but if your baseplate is stacked taller with a riser and you're running a lens support on rods, things might get complicated. The removable handle of the FX6 has several big upgrades, including better mounting options, more custom buttons, and better thumb screws. The handle now has the perfect mounting spot to throw a magic arm on with a monitor attached located on the back slope. 2 extra custom buttons have been added, plus a scroll wheel and multi-selector in addition to the zoom rocker and record button. As someone who doesn't run these cameras with the grip attached, it's great recovering a few extra custom buttons here that get lost with the grip gone. And now the 2 thumb screws feature an Allen key hole to screw down the handle tighter than previously possible with just your fingers. I like this since the FS5 handle will loosen over time, but with this and using a tool, it does not budge. That said, if you do tighten them on with a tool, in my experience you have to also loosen with the tool, so it's not a super quick detachment like with using just the thumb screws. While it didn't affect me during shooting, one downside to the FX6 design is that both XLR inputs are located on the handle. That means if you like to customize your rig a little more with top plates and third-party handles, you're gonna lose these. Looking at the LCD monitor, they've now added 3 buttons to the side, one for toggling the focus peaking, another for toggling zebras, and a third that's a customizable button. Again, I appreciate more buttons that don't depend on having the grip attached. One of the biggest draws to the FX6 over Sony Alpha cameras is the built-in variable ND filter. It's capable of blocking between 2 to 7 stops of light, and I use it just about every day I'm out shooting. With the FX6, the variable ND filter activation and deactivation are on 2 separate buttons and have an independent wheel for only changing the filter strength. There's a menu setting for when I turn the wheel all the way to the lightest filtration and keep turning. It will also move to off, and when it's off I can raise filtration on the wheel and it turns back on. Keeping in mind turning the ND off and on takes some time to perform. I found this setting too risky and would often overturn when I didn't mean to and waste seconds getting my shot ready with the right exposure. In practice, I like the on and off buttons instead of turning a wheel, but overall I didn't like the way the FX6 deals with all of this in the layout and still prefer my FS5, where both of my methods for limiting exposure, the aperture and ND filter, use the same dial and toggle between the two with a switch. A few other miscellaneous things that I didn't like about the design include the microphone mount, which I found was extremely saggy on the review copy I had. Using the same microphone in the same way on my FS5 doesn't sag nearly at all. Next is the main dial on the camera, which I find to be too stiff on the spin. This makes it more finicky than it should be to scrub to a particular item because the tension to get it going often makes you start jumping over multiple items items once it's in motion. Lastly, I'm sure someone out there will appreciate that the grip and link inputs are separate now. For me, I preferred having the link being alone on the right side of the FS5. When I mount the camera to my tripod, plugging in the link trigger is the one thing I need to do, and I find it usually takes longer with it on the back with a bunch of other ports and wires and behind a door, rather than just having an open hole easy to get to on the side. Autofocus is an area where I can plainly say that the FX6 got a noticeable upgrade. No, you don't want to use it full time, half time, or even a quarter of the time, but that doesn't mean there's no role for it here. It can be especially useful for impossibly fast birds in flight that are moving toward or away the camera where doing it manually reaches that threshold of being too much. It also comes in handy when you're shooting in an awkward position. Say you're sitting on one side of your tripod and an animal keeps moving around past your sitting position, and now your lens is pointing almost back towards you, but you can't just move your body around the tripod without creating too much of a disturbance for the animal. So you get twisted in a position where you might be able to see the general framing of a shot in the monitor, but you're not in a great place to check critical focus anymore. And lastly would be the razor thin depth of field shots where the animal is moving around. This becomes incredibly challenging with manual focus, and normally you could close down the aperture a bit for some relief, but if for any reason this is the shot you're after, the autofocus will probably hold on a little longer than you can do it manually. One fantastic addition to the FX6 is the possibility for full-time manual focus override through the camera end. Some Sony lenses are marketed with this feature, but it never made sense to me why these focus-by-wire lenses shouldn't just be something controlled on the camera end. Well, this confirms that they can, but they just don't usually do it. This is called AF Assist in the menu, and it can be turned on or off. If you have it on, be sure to watch your focus mode. A couple of times because of the AF Assist, I thought I was actually in manual focus since the focus ring was responsive, but then autofocus kicked back in with bad timing as I was actually in autofocus mode. So if it becomes too confusing or there are too many accidental shifts, it can be disabled through the menu. Also new with the FX6 is the 7-step customizable autofocus transition speed, as well as a 5-step autofocus subject shift sensitivity. Plus, both of them can be mapped to a single custom button with 2 press levels, so they are easy to access and adjust depending on the situation. I mentioned in the introduction how the FX6 steps up with this internal recording. The camera can now do up to 4K 120 frames per second, 10-bit 422 at 600 megabits per second data rate, and record continuously until the media fills up. This is helpful for extended sequences where the action continues to unfold over a greater length of time. The same goes for 1080p at 240 frames per second. It's continuously recording with no hard time limit. While filming birds and wildlife, having these options to slow down the fast movements is becoming essential in showing the viewer behavior of the animal they haven't noticed before. Unfortunately, the way slow and quick is handled on the FX6 is not quite as nice as the FS5. On the FS5, there are 2 levels to the S&Q button, where the first brings up S&Q mode and the second brings up super slow motion mode. What this means in practice is that while inactive, I'm recording 4K 24p. On the first press, I'm recording 4K 120p to my Atomos recorder, and on the second press, I'm recording 2K 240p to my Atomos. For the FX6, you can't jump image size like this, and there's only 1 level to the button. So in practice there, with it inactive, I'm shooting 4K 24p, and then after pressing it, I'm doing 4K 120p. But if I want to record 1080p at 240 frames per second, I have to dive into the menu and switch the recording format over to 1080p first, and that takes too much time. I would love to see a second level added in a firmware update, even if they can't move image formats, as that would still open up switching 4K 24p, 60p, and 120p all super quickly. One massive loss to the FX6 is that there are now no more cache recording options. It's almost unbelievable that Sony took away something this valuable. Cache recording allows the camera to keep recording footage to a buffer, but not the memory card. After an action happens, one can hit record, and then everything that just happened and was in the buffer spills onto the memory card. Another downside to the FX6 is that it went with a full frame sensor over Super 35. Worse, the full frame sensor used here does not have the resolution resolution to support a Super 35 mode while recording 4K. The only way around this would be to use clear image zoom in 4K, which is a smarter digital zoom developed by Sony and in the FX6 can increase the frame size up to 1.5 times. For wildlife video, I'll take Super 35 over full frame every day, as you get the 1.5 times enlargement while keeping the resolution and apparent increased depth of field with subjects equal size in the frame. So this is definitely something to be aware of if you own APS-C lenses or are looking for a camera more suitable for long lens wildlife productions. One positive about the FX6 is that using shutter angle instead of shutter speed is now fixed. So for the FS5 cameras, using shutter angle was basically never possible, even though the option was in the menu because of a bug that they chose to never fix, where if you use slow and quick mode, the shutter angle gets all funky and doesn't do what you want it to. It essentially sets itself at the wrong number and it can't be fixed. I'll be honest, I don't want to give Sony the satisfaction of saying this is an upgrade over the FS5 because it's absolutely bullshit. This bug was never fixed. Sony should be ashamed of themselves, and I don't care if it's been 6 years since the FS5 Mark I came out. Fix your cameras when you have issues like this that throw off the entire usability. Anyway, having shutter angle there now is fantastic because it's a lot less scrolling and dialing in a shutter speed every time you switch the frame rate. The FX6 is a mighty fine camera that steps up the internal recording formats and includes color profiles that look stunningly great in almost any lighting condition. In execution, it's a little bit of a letdown with some of the changes that were made outside of the internal recording options, color, and autofocus. Many for the worse in my opinion. The move to full frame is unfortunate considering that they didn't put enough pixels on the sensor to make it a non-issue. Cache recording is insanely helpful and greatly missed. Then some of the usability stuff seems like a step down from a 6-year-old design. On its own, it's probably worth renting and using yourself to try out. For me, who already owns an FS5 paired with an Atomos Inferno, the only real beneficial difference is being able to record 4K 120p non-stop and perhaps some better noise performance in extreme cases. Otherwise, everything is close enough to the same or worse for my uses. For those not wanting to get an Atomos recorder and just want a simple monitor or nothing at all for extreme portability, the FX6 will be clearly superior in capability.